Testing. Where's Sue, by the way? Wonder if she's. Huh. We do. We have. Oh, frick. Yeah, I want to take that. We do have the books for the Sunday class. Uh, Plan, like I mentioned, huh? No, no. The plan is to start it after the meeting. I think the Sunday after the meeting should work. We may go over a little bit, but I think that's probably about right. But in this one, we've got still what 8 more lessons in the book. Well, there's 17 lessons, and we're in lesson 9, so we've got still more to go, which is fine because I didn't really wasn't in a particular hurry, and I would like to, if we're going to do the journeys of Paul after this, nice to have a little bit more time to work on that and get it all to figure out how I want to do that. Um, I could cheat and go buy a book, but I don't know. I don't like doing that, but sometimes. Well, well, I'd like to do my own thing. My issue when I've not done a class before sometimes is just figuring out how to structure it and how to break it up into different classes, and sometimes just getting an idea of how to approach it is helpful. And then I'll just ignore that and just write my own stuff. But but anyway, or I could be like my brother and just write workbooks and publish them and use those. But I had um, I'm gonna turn my mic off so I want to sit. Campbell Road last night and reminded of one of the rows of their parents. I wonder if you could see it. Shakes hand. Uh, it took 5 minutes to figure out when he thought of a cow. Yes, he said, I've been still listening. I look like a podcast, although I'm a little behind on it. I haven't done my podcast in 3 years. Are you wish you were a cow? So, so it's always enjoyable. We got to see Tim Stevens and Vicky. Oh, was that Vicky? Okay. Well, good, good. Um, I've met him a couple of times, but I'm sure he wouldn't have known me. He knows Hal, but uh, well, Hal's done Hal did RJ's singing class way back when he was younger, uh, and so I'm sure they've met in a number of contexts there. So anyway, enough of that. We're talking about the Messianic Psalms today. Let me get this going. I'm out of practice on Wednesday nights apparently because I keep forgetting to turn things on. But we're going to go through. We spent some time a little bit last time. It's been I know 3 weeks or so, and talking about just some of the importance and some of the things in general that we get out of the Psalms and how they point forward to the Messiah. And today, in this lesson, we're going to look more specifically at really three of the Psalms, uh, probably three of the most prominent messianic psalms in the Bible that we typically look at, and make some observations on those. In Psalm 22 is the first one we're going to go to. So if you want to look over to Psalm chapter 22, or the 22nd Psalm, I should say. It's not Psalm chapter 22; it's the 22nd Psalm. Um, I'm trying to break that habit, but I can say Psalm 22. That's right. Um, would that they had titles. I guess they kind of did. Um, all right, so Psalm 22, and we'll go ahead and read through this, and then we'll make some observations. Starts in verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm, not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make they make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He, he trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help me. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me. The company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. You have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offsprings of Jacob, glorify him. Stand in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from it. But he has heard when he cried to him. From you come my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him shall praise the Lord. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship before him shall bow. All who go down to the dust, even the one, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So, just real quickly, it's interesting that when you look at this, um, there's a pattern that you notice a lot of times in the Psalms when the writer, in this case David, will kind of go back and forth with him. It's almost like he's having a conversation with himself. Because he goes back, he starts off with the idea of his lament. This is, he's asking God, why have you turned away from me? And then he goes on and says, but you are holy. And he talks about how great God is. And then he goes back, but I am a worm. I'm rejected by, he talks about his own failings and how he has been accepted. And then he goes back, but you have accepted me in the past. In other words, I've been rejected, but I know that you have done this. It keeps going back between the people who hate him and the God who he puts his trust in. And he calls at that point for the deliverance of his enemies. He points out his own weakness and frailty, and not just his frailty and weakness, but his humiliation at the hands of his enemies. And he calls finally in verses 19 through 22 for deliverance from these. And finally, in the final section of it, oh, actually, there's one more. He calls for praise in the congregation. This is his response to what God has done for him. And then finally, that there will be praise not just to the congregation, but praise to all the world. That because of what God has done for him and what God does for his people, uh, the nations around will come to know who God is. And so when you read that, there's some things that you can look at, and as you think about this, is there a sense in which this could be applied to David? Would you say, yeah? I mean, there's a sense. I mean, would you say how much of this do you think you could say, at least on one level, applies to David? Okay, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, and that certainly falls in the idea of humiliation. The way that he had to leave Jerusalem, there was certainly a humiliation aspect of that. And even when you think about as he leaves, is it Shimei, the Benjamite who comes out, hurls insults at him, throws rocks at him, throws dust at him. That was certainly this idea of scorn and ridicule that's going on there. So there's a lot of things there that certainly point to David. in terms of his own life. But when you think about this, and the book asks the question, how do we know that this is not talking about David? And it asks us to list six things that are prophesied in Psalm 22. And I guess the point that I would make on this is six things, or at least a couple of things among that we look at and say, I don't think this really fits what David went through. And what are some things that we look at in this psalm that maybe jump out at us? Yeah, that's the big one. There's a very specific thing that they're doing, and it's hard to, I guess you could argue, well, he's talking metaphorically, but metaphorically of what? It's, when you pierce somebody's hands and feet, one of the other things about that, of course, is he's clearly talking about a form of crucifixion, which, if you look at what kind of judgment or what kind of death he would have looked at in his culture under the law, how would he have been killed? David. Yeah. No, they weren't doing. Yeah, yeah, there were no crucifixions then. Well, he could have been killed with a sword. Certainly, he could have. Saul had people. Had, yeah, stoning is more likely, but either of those are things that would happen. But the idea of being tortured to death, especially in this manner, I always wonder what people thought. Maybe I should go research this at some point. What the Jewish rabbis would have thought about when they looked at this, because this is not something that really fit anything that would have happened then. So, if you're going to talk about a metaphorical persecution or torture, you typically are going to try to relate it to something that people will see, and kind of like what he's done in these other sections. So this idea of being crucified uh, doesn't really fit with David. What else? What else do we see here? Yeah, there's another, a very specific one, and let's bring that into a third one. If you're in a position where you're nailed to a cross and your garments are divided, what exactly are the odds that you're going to get down off the cross at that point? No, he's clearly talking about somebody who has no ability to save himself, who's going to die. You know, David was in some bad situations in his life, but he was never in a position where hope is gone. I'm now going to die, and especially not from that standpoint that, yeah, they're dividing up my garments. There's a lot of things. Anything else you notice in here that jump out? Okay, I yeah, I can count all my bones. Let's talk about that real quick, because I think that's interesting. There's something that came out of that. Uh, if you were going to describe that, when you think about someone saying, "I can count all my bones," what does that make you think of? Malnourished. Okay, probably so. No, I wouldn't say that. And in fact, the Bible. I should have put this in. When John interprets that passage, look over in John 19, because John cites this as well, but he takes a different interpretation of it. I'm kind of curious what the Septuagint says about this, which is what John would have read from. Um, down in verse 34 of John 19, it says, "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you may also believe. For these things took place that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken." So John looks at this and interprets it not just the fact that I can count or I can tell all my bones, that I can look at them all, with the implication being I don't see any that are broken or out of place. I can look down all of them. They're all, nothing's been done to them. David. Yeah, yeah. Dehydration could do that as well. Yeah, severe blood loss. Mhm. Yeah. No, no, it's really not. And to your point, maybe not in his front, but his back had been scourged to the point where at that level of scourging, you got somebody who very likely his bones may have even been visible. Mhm. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very, very possibly. So there's that idea of, I can tell all my bones, not only that I can count them that they're visible, but as John interprets that they are all somehow intact. Uh, and, and there's something else about this as well. There's the implication, and I was reading some people that brought this up, that it, the idea they look and stare at me, which sounds weird. The implication is looking with delight. The idea, in other words, I'm being put on display for everybody to see, and they're looking up at me. Normally, when you think about someone in this position, I wouldn't want to see that. I would look away because it's horrifying. And yet these people are looking at him and saying, "That's exactly what he deserves. This is exactly what we wanted." In fact, if anything, he's not suffering enough. That's the idea that he's seeing. So this is a cruel spectacle that's being talked about here, that's being described, and it got me thinking about something, and it reminded me of something that's in Job that I went down that rabbit hole and I came up with something that I hadn't really noticed before. Look over Job chapter 33. I haven't done a lesson on Job yet. I need to do a lesson on Job. It's one of my favorite books to Job 33. This is for just quick review of the book of Job. You got Job sitting down in his suffering. His three friends come. They all get into an argument in prose about why he's suffering and what I understand and what I don't. And all the accusations go back and forth. And then this man named Elihu, a young man named Elihu, stands up. And there's different ideas on what he and who he represents, and is he a good guy, a bad guy, is he a prophet, is he not? And I won't go into all that, but he says some things here that are really useful and just made me think. In verse 33, he's in verse 9, excuse me, chapter 33. He starts off, he's talking to Job initially. He says, "You say I'm pure without transgression." In other words, you haven't done anything wrong. You haven't done anything deserving of this. "I am clean and there's no iniquity in me. Behold, he finds occasion against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths." In other words, you're saying that God is actively persecuting you. Kind of sounds a little bit like on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you put me here? Why are you making me or allowing me to go through this kind of suffering?" And Elihu tells him, "You're wrong about this." He says God is not treating you as an enemy or treating you unfairly. Uh, he says the idea that God won't answer my words apparently is the response. Job has been saying, "I've been pouring my heart to God. God won't answer me." And Elihu says, "No, but God does answer men when they cry." And he says he does it in two ways. The first one, he says, is that he answers in a dream or in a vision or in the night. But if you go down to verse 19, he says there's another way that God answers men. He says he answers it through suffering. He says in verse 19, "Man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes bread. His appetite, the choicest foods, his flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen. His bones that were not seen stick out." By the way, that's the thing that I was thinking about. And I go, that sounds kind of familiar. And listen to how he describes this. He says, "His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the thousand, to declare to man what is right for him, and he is merciful to him." It says, "Deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youth's vigor." Then man prays to God and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy. He restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, "I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light." As you read that, right, what's Elihu describing here? What's the scene that he is setting in this description? There's, yeah, you could say that, I think. Um, yeah, it's a reprieve, isn't it? And how does he get the reprieve? What saves him? He calls out, right? His soul draws near the pit. In other words, he's drawing near to death. His life to those who bring death. And what does it say there? If there be what? In verse 23. A mediator to declare to man what is right for him. And it says what? Who says to deliver him? Who's the one that says, "Let this man live"? Well, yeah, the angel or the mediator. And by the way, the angel, it's the same word that might be used. I have to go back in Hebrew, but I believe it's the same word that could be messenger. He may not be referring to an angel specifically, but a messenger from God, or he says a median. And I can't remember. I haven't looked at my notes, but that phrase "one in a thousand," there's something very. That's not just a. That's someone who is unique in all the world. That's what they're talking about there. If there was one person that had authority or the ability to mediate that nobody else had, and he stood up for you and said, let him live, then what would happen? Could he'd let him live. And not only would he live, but his flesh would be restored, he says. He would return to the days of his youthful vigor. And then he accepts and he talks about the idea that I sinned. In verse 27, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not. In other words, God did not allow me to suffer the judgment that was due to me because this mediator interceded on my behalf. Well, what are we talking about here? Yeah, it's yeah, yeah. There, that's a pretty clear prophetic utterance here that's kind of uh, hidden over a little bit. But in retrospect, we look back, and this is clearly Elihu talking about the fact that there's a mediator that intercedes on man's behalf. You know, Job, you're saying God doesn't hear your prayers. God has given a mediator that will save the man from death. Uh, but when you look at this, and that's a great point, but that's not the thing that I wanted to connect. The idea is that if I'm a Jew and I'm seeing this man and he's hanging in this situation, he's crying out to God. What does this man confess that put him on that cross to begin with? What does he say? Is he guilty or is he innocent? What? Yeah. What would he say in reading this? This man. Yeah. He's confessing sin. Yeah. If you're looking at, and that's the natural thing. And I think that going back to the psalm, when you're looking at this person on the cross, you're seeing an image of somebody who clearly had to have been a sinner. It's the story of Job. It's the story of that's how Jews viewed suffering. If you're doing something that bad, you know again it's the blind man who sinned, he or his parents. Uh, that idea that so when going back to what I was talking about, the idea of this suffering man being a spectacle. They stare at me. They're looking at you and saying, this is a man who's getting exactly what he deserves because he claimed to be God. He claimed to be the Son of God. And so he's being held up in this idea of ridicule. It's, I just thought it was interesting how some of those types just continue to connect themselves back. And you start to see even more the visual of the shame and the rejection that this passage is talking about when we describe this idea of the suffering Messiah. So let's see, we talked about that. He brings up some different things in this section. He talks about the idea that Jesus has been forsaken, or at least, and there's a couple of different ways. We talk about this a lot. We sing that song, "The Father turns His face away." And there's some people that will argue that when Jesus was on the cross and the light was turned away and they went into darkness for 3 hours, that this was God turning his face away and severing fellowship with Jesus because Jesus now had literally become sin, and therefore God could no longer be in fellowship with him. Now, I've heard that all my life, and I don't know that it's a point worth getting in an argument about, but I will say this: I've always, the more I thought of it, I thought to myself, the whole point of having a sacrifice is that it's pure. When we talk about Jesus taking on or becoming sin, I don't think he's talking about a literal idea that he literally became sin so much as he literally became the offering or the representation of sin. But when we see this idea of Jesus crying out, and this man, the Messiah, calling out, "Why have you forsaken me?" As we get to the end, what do we learn? Has God forsaken him? No, he hasn't. But he's allowed him to go through this. He's allowed him to go through this great suffering along the way. And so he talks about this idea, first of all, that we see the picture of Jesus being forsaken, or at least apparently forsaken on the cross. And he's forsaken clearly from the standpoint that, as we said, here is a righteous man that's calling out for mercy, and yet God is going to refuse to help him. Go ahead, Dave. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It may have felt like it in the moment. It was certainly a momentary forsaking in a way, but ultimately it wasn't. Yeah. Mark actually talked a lot about that, the idea of feeling that in the midst of our suffering that we feel as if God has turned our back on him, on us, because he's allowing us to go through these things. And then we remind ourselves of all the things that God has allowed all his people to go through. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And you know what's interesting about that? I've thought about this a lot more and more. I've read articles that talk about how the view of the crucifixion has undergone uh, changes. Maybe isn't the right word, but different different points of emphasis over the years. And a few years back, the emphasis really shifted to the just the brutality and the sheer pain and agony that Jesus was going through. We had the passion of the passion of the Christ and some of the just the horrific things that he went through, and that's frankly what we tend to talk about when we have the Lord's Supper. We talk about Jesus' death. We talk about his pain and suffering. We have songs about that, and that's not wrong. But it's interesting to me that when you read the gospel, it never talks about Jesus' suffering. It doesn't even address his pain. Now, he's scourged. He's hung. It's very clear that he is suffering, but that's not the emphasis. The emphasis is on his humiliation, on his degradation, on the rejection, on the idea that he is being held up as an object of ridicule. And I always think about that. If we think about Jesus as the personification of the word, he is the gospel. What does Jesus describe? How does Jesus describe the gospel in the eyes of the world? It's a stumbling block. It's ridiculous. It's worthy of being mocked. And that's kind of what you see on the cross. This is the word of God. This is God's redemptive offer. And what does mankind think of it? They put it up, they nail it to a cross, and they laugh at it because that's how we see God's redemption and God's offer. And so, and I think that's intentional. And again, that's my thing. Mark, did you have something? I still have a problem is struggle with it. So Jesus knew why he was born. Yeah. He was born because. Yeah. And if you look at the Greek word that's used for forsaken, it's turn away from. Yeah. And I think we have to look at Jesus like a scapegoat. The sins weren't placed on him, and he was sent out of him. The sins weren't placed on Christ, and that's what God could not look at. And so, from that standpoint, not my God, why am I having to do this? My God, why are you turning away from me? Why are you forsaking me? In that sense, that he could not look upon him during that period. Okay. Okay. Why he was there? I don't think he would have a question. Why am I doing this? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was not I don't think that's what he's saying either. I think he's quoting Psalm 22. I think he's alluding back to this image. And my point has always been that if I'm a disciple and I'm in my right mind and I'm focusing and thinking, and maybe I'm never going to be able to do this at this moment, but in retrospect, I realize what he's doing is quoting Psalm 22 that starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And how does it end? It ends with rejoicing. And in fact, it ends with people going out into the world and telling them, hey, look what God did with this man. Good. And it's also been brought up throughout the ages that another reason that he said that, which I don't put so much weight, but the reason was to point Psalm. Yeah. So people would understand it's being fulfilled. Yeah. Prophecy is fulfilled. Yeah. And I think I suspect that's part of it. Again, Jesus does not say anything by accident. I don't see any examples where Jesus just randomly just starts blurting things out. There's a point for everything that he says. But to your point, I don't know that it's a big deal one way or the other. But I think what we do see there is this imagery of a death that has a lot more meaning and a lot more substance, I think, than anything that David would have ever gone through. And so it's hard to read this and think that, well, yeah, David's just being hyperbolic about his own suffering. There's clearly something going on that's beyond that. He makes the point that Jesus dies of a broken heart, which I've heard people talk about this literally. I don't know. Again, to your like you were saying earlier, I don't know how much weight I put on this, but John talks about the idea that when Jesus is pierced, he brings forth blood and water, and I've heard people say, well, that's a sign that he's clearly died because now the blood has begun to separate. I've heard some people that say that there's some sort of a sac around the heart that's punctured. And Laura can speak to that more than me. I have no idea if any of that's true, but but it clearly, and I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I will say that John was very, very adamant that it happened, which tells me that one reason or another there was some real significance to what he saw. I suspect it had something to do with the fact that if you punch somebody in a hole in somebody's side and blood and water comes out, that means you're dead. I suspect that's kind of the point he's trying to make. Beyond that, I don't really know. But he talks about this idea. He describes the idea of being brokenhearted. This isn't just about pain and suffering. It's about the idea of rejection, as we talked about. The idea that he says, I've been poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. I'm melted within me. I've got nothing left. Just the exhaustion of carrying this weight and having to undergo what he has undergone and watching these people surrounding him as he's crying out, forgive them. They don't know what to do. It must have been just a heartbreaking thing for Jesus. And we, and we talk about Jesus' battles with the Pharisees and his arguments, and it's easy to lose sight of the fact that these were people that Jesus loved just as much as he loved the tax collectors and the sinners. Uh, and and surely it must have been just a heartbreaking thing for him to know that they're not going to listen. They're not, even though he knew that they wouldn't. Um, we talked about Jesus' hands and feet being pierced, of course. Talked about him being mocked and being openly displayed, again, being shown to be, or at least in the appearance of someone who was a criminal. His garments were divided. And so all these things kind of add up to point to the idea that there's some things here, obviously, that really can't be applied to David. And clearly there's something more going on. And I suspect that the people of that day, as they read this before Jesus came about, understood that. And I always find it ironic that you've got these men who were well versed in the scriptures, who were literally by their own words fulfilling, wagging their heads. He saved others. He can't save himself. He trusted in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Almost saying exactly what David said in the Psalms that they would say. And they're so consumed with hate and so consumed with ridiculing him and presumably triumphing over him that they don't see what's going on. So, any other thoughts or comments on Psalm 22? All right, so we've got this first psalm that talks about the idea of the suffering of the Messiah, and we got the second one in Psalm 110 that we look at, which talks about a slightly different aspect of it. If you turn over to Psalm 110. And in Psalm 10, David again writing, he says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook to the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head." So, as we're looking at this again, David is talking, puts himself in this, but he introduces a third character. And if you remember, when Jesus refers to this in the gospel, what's the question? Do you remember that Jesus puts forth here about this psalm? You remember what the story, the incident I'm talking about? If you remember, he's sitting with the Pharisees and he asks them a question. He says, um, well, he sort of, he asked the question of the Pharisees, who's David talking about here? His son, or is it somebody else? As he says, if David calls his son Lord, how is he his Lord? How is it possible for David's son to be exalted over David? Yeah, yeah. And by the way, why would that be an issue? Do you have an idea? Why would that be so hard for the Pharisees to understand? That if David has a physical son and he calls his own son Lord, why is that a problem? Yeah, you don't know. The son is never exalted over the father. It doesn't matter. Even if, like for example, when David, when he names Solomon king while he's still alive and puts him on the throne, even then, I guarantee you, David was not calling Solomon Lord. That's just not how it worked. You didn't. Your father was always above you. The idea that David would be calling his son Lord just doesn't make any sense at all. And so David asked, "Well, who is it then?" He says he's your son. He says, "This is my descendant. He's gonna raise a son up for me, and this is who he's clearly talking about. But how can he be David's son if he's calling him Lord?" And of course, the answer, there's only one person that can be higher than the king, and that's God. And of course, he doesn't answer the question, but the Pharisees are unable to as well. But that's the first implication that comes right out of the bat in this passage, that we're talking about someone who coming after David who has greater authority than him. But then it's interesting in verse 2 through 4 or 2 through 5 that something happens differently. When you describe, when you think about a kingly mission, God sends the king out to do what? What's he going to do out once he rides out of his castle with his armies to do what? He's going to fight. He's going to conquer the enemies. But what's being described here? He says, he says, rule in the midst of your enemies. But then he says, what? Three, your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments from the womb of the morning. The dew of your youth will be yours. What's he describing there? What does that sound like to you? Well, I don't know that it's fighting though. I guess you could make an argument for it. But what's it being described? Your people will offer themselves freely, wearing what? Holy garments. What does that suggest? Suggest they're priests. Okay. So now your people are priests, and they're offering sacrifices, and they're doing it in a context seems to be talking a whole lot more about worship and service in the temple than it does. So now you've got a king, but he seems to be doing work as a priest is. And sure enough, in verse 4, he brings that out because he says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." So now we've got a king, but the king's being named a priest, and the priest is offering sacrifices, and his people are assisting in that. Well, what's the problem with that? How can that be David's son? Yeah, he can't do that. He can't go in the Holy of Holies. He can't. Solomon couldn't do that. He built the temple, but he couldn't go in. Solomon couldn't offer sacrifices. We see, the story of Uzziah years and years later, who decided he got so excited about serving God that he wanted to go into the temple and do it himself, and God struck him with leprosy. That just wasn't done. And so, but here we see a man who God deems so worthy of being a priest that even though he's not of the right lineage, what does he do to allow this man to become a priest? What kind of priest is he? After the order of Melchizedek. I want you to be a priest so much that I'm going to get rid of the old priesthood and establish a priesthood that was way back in the days of Abraham and Melchizedek. That's not even we don't even have it anymore. It's not a thing in the law of Moses, but I'm going to give you that priesthood and you alone. Now, when you think about, just as I think about that, the idea of seeing someone that I want him to be a priest so badly that I will change the law to make sure that he can do that. What kind of a priest are we talking about here? There's, I guess if you're Jeroboam and you divided the kingdom and you said, well, I just want to be popular, so I'll just let everybody be a priest. But on this hand, we're talking about one man who is uniquely qualified and uniquely selected to be priest. So we got the image now of not only we've got a king, we've seen a king that is going to suffer. We've seen a king whose main work appears to be worship and leading others in worship and purifying and sanctification and offering sacrifices. So we're starting to get a sense on uh, the work and the work and the plan of God about this Messiah. It's not a typical king, and that brings us to this third. And how much, David? How much time do you need? Not much. Okay, I won't. I'm almost done. We're almost finished up here. Um, so that gets us into Psalm 16, and Psalm 16 is much shorter. We'll look at it real fast, and then we'll wrap it up. He says in verse 1 of Psalm 16, "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. To say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another God shall multiply their drink offerings of blood. I will not pour out or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup, and you hold my lot. The lion has fallen for me in a pleasant place. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh shall also dwell secure, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You made known to me the paths of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forever. As you look at that, this the the man that the psalmist is speaking for, and obviously again, uh, is this talking about David? David's writing, but he's talking about the Christ. And by the way, how do we know this is not talking about David? What's the definitive proof that's offered in the New Testament? Yeah, David's, Peter says, look, David's tomb is here with us to this day. We know where David is. He's dead, he's in the ground, but Jesus is not. And the idea that he has, and he's describing a man who is able to serve God in courage and joy and confidence. And the main source of that confidence is because I know that God will not allow my flesh to see corruption. And in Jesus' case, what we find out is that even if I die, God will raise me up. The idea that Jesus, the Messiah, will be able to fully do all that God has called me to do, or called him to do, because he's been given this level of assurance. And so we've got the idea of, again, we talked about how that's clearly not talking about David here. It's talking about one who will not suffer corruption. So you see in these three Psalms, three primary aspects of what we learn about the Messiah just from the book of Psalms. We see his mission, the idea that he is going to be one who suffers. He's going to be someone who has a unique mission that's not like any other king before him. And he's going to have a unique hope, if that's a typo, a unique hope that ends up getting passed on. As I think about this, how much of this, as we read these, in a sense, applies to us? Are we going to suffer? Yeah, we're called to suffer. We were talking about John 11. Mark was talking about John 11 last night. And the idea that, and it struck me that how many times that this emphasis is that this is Jesus's friend, Lazarus, and you let him die. You didn't do anything. There's any number of things you could have done to fix this. You could have sent the messenger back and said, just like you did with the centurion, your master lives. Go ahead. But he didn't do that. He allowed him to die. Does God allow us to go through things? He absolutely does. The mission, the idea that you're going to be given a purpose that's not like a typical king, and as citizens of a kingdom, what is our mission? How are we described? A kingdom of what? A kingdom of priests. Our role is going to be that of worshiping and glorifying our King and our God. And finally, that idea of the hope. Is God going to allow our flesh to see corruption? Only for a short time. But there's that idea, that promises, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, that what is sowed in corruption is raised in power and strength and immortality. and the idea that we have that same hope because Jesus has that hope. We now have that hope as well. And so, anyway, so we'll go ahead and stop there then, and I'll turn it over to David. And we will pick up next week on lesson 10, which is the imprecatory Psalms. So, thanks, everybody.